Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 225 and I am the show's host Kyle. Joining me on today's show is, I guess the person we should call the unofficial co-host at this point, Will Porter. Will, welcome back to the show.
Hey Kyle, I'm glad to be back on. How are you?
Well, I'm doing well, and for those of you who don't know Will, which seems unlikely at this point, he is a freelance journalist who specializes in Mideast affairs and U.S. foreign policy. His work can be found at antiwar.com, libertarianinstitute.org, and consortiumnews.com. Of course, Libertarian Institute is the place that you go for mine and Will's author archives. I think most of our work has been either published or republished on that site. You'll find this show and my daily news round up there as well. Well, I got Will on today's show to talk about, quite a lot of stuff, but a lot of it is going to revolve around kind of who Donald Trump is and the media reaction to him, which is something I've talked about a lot on this show, just because, when me and Will go out and talk to people about foreign policy issues, most of them really only know what they read or see in the mainstream media. And for that reason, a lot of people are highly misinformed on issues and I think have the complete wrong opinion, like Russia is an enemy of the United States and the United States people. And so we're going to get into a lot of that today. And I think a story that really shows how hysterical the U.S. media has become towards Russia is something that surfaces about 10 or 11 days after the actual Trump-Putin summit. And it deals with the object that Putin gave Trump at the summit. And this was a soccer ball, like a official World Cup soccer ball. Trump didn't seem to take any particular care with the soccer ball. I mean, he looked at it and then he bounced it over to Melania and said he's giving it to Barron. And of course, you had the immediate reaction, people going, what a disgrace. I can't believe Trump bounced the soccer ball, or I can't believe Trump is giving the soccer ball to a spoiled son, and all this other kind of stupid analysis that really doesn't matter. And all it was is a good faith gesture, I'm sure, between Putin to Donald Trump. But, they always had to distort it and turn it into something ugly. And the way they're doing it this time is by titling a couple articles. I saw one in Bloomberg and one on CNN. And the titles of the articles went something like this. Putin gave Donald Trump a soccer ball with an electronic or a transmitter inside of it. And then CNN at least took the courtesy to put comma, the logo indicates. So what we have, kind of going on here is the World Cup had official soccer balls and they had some kind of little electronic device in it where you could scan the device and link the soccer ball to your phone. And this will give you special access to the World Cup kind of stuff. It's, nothing it basically had Donald Trump given Vladimir Putin a Fitbit. The Fitbit would have had much more sophisticated technology in it. However, they really don't even know that, the soccer ball that Donald Trump gave Vladimir Putin gave Donald Trump has that, transponder in it. They're just saying that the, ones at the World Cup did. And so this means that one possibly could. There's no sources from the, Secret Service or any kind of, U.S. intelligence agency saying they found evidence of a spying device in the soccer ball. However, Will, I think a lot of people, and most people just read the headline, walk away with the impression that here we have the president of Russia pulling a Trojan horse, giving Donald Trump a gift that's really a, plant that's going to be used to hurt the United States of America in the form of a soccer ball at this key summit that's bringing these two leaders together. So I think it probably gives people a really negative image of Vladimir Putin, the idea of having talks with Russia. What do you think about this, Will?
Yeah, I mean, I think this sort of it might even represent a new low with the media's, their performance here on this whole Russia thing. Because I don't think any serious person, a journalist or anybody who has any knowledge of intelligence agencies or how intelligence operations work would actually think that this is the way an intelligence operation would work. That the president, Vladimir Putin, is going to give a soccer ball with a transmitter, and they expect Donald Trump to just hold this soccer ball in all of his important meetings or something? When Trump said that he was going to give it to Barron, did Putin go, oh dang it, my plan is foiled now? This is just, on the face of it, it's outrageous. It can't be a serious accusation, and it must just be for people who are not serious, people who might just see this headline and sort of go, oh boy, they're trying to spy on us. So it's really a new low, I think. It's just on every angle, it's outrageous.
Right, and I think there's, maybe not huge consequences to this. And I'm not saying that this story is going to manipulate U.S. and Russian relations to the point that we end up at nuclear war. However, those events are never just one big issue. It's a collection of little things that continue to happen. And this is just another one of those examples, another one of those little things that you have that shows, that really CNN and the mainstream media are at best, going for clickbait here, or, potentially just, I guess, trying to take a shot at Donald Trump, but at worst, trying to undermine, actually potential peace between U.S. and Russian relations. And as Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin pointed out at the conference, the two men that control 90% of the world's hydrogen bombs are standing in that room. And so maybe it's kind of important that they don't become best friends, but at least don't hate each other and think they're trying to, spy on each other and humiliate each other like this. Because certainly Vladimir Putin, even, if he gave that to Donald Trump, it would be an insult to Donald Trump, I think, trying to, pose a gift as an actual, kind of, sneaky device.
Yeah. And I think something that should be pointed out here too is just like you said, this one story is kind of trivial. It's not going to lead to anything, but it's a matter of how they stack up, of how these different stupid little stories and events get stacked up into a big fake list. And then people can cite that as it, and, make it look like, boy, like the Russians have really done a lot to us here in these last, in these recent years. But really, if you look closer at each one of those individual stories, you see that there's no there, or it's all just kind of silly or based on nothing. But I think that's important how that happens, how they build up these little stories incrementally until they have this full-fledged, mythology about Russia. And that's worrying.
Right. And, in 2002, I was really just a kid, but at that time, looking back, everybody knew that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, even though he actually didn't, and they never found them. And so it's a situation like this, where there's all these little stories that add up to why, Trump doesn't, end up getting along with Vladimir Putin, or the Americans don't trust Russia. And then, that popular opinion turns U.S. policy. One place this, could be happening is we have Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, testifying before Congress that the U.S. will never recognize the annexation of Crimea. And so, Will, let's just start. Can you just kind of explain to us what the situation, how that kind of developed in Crimea, and then we could get into why it's so important the United States and Russia at least, try and move past this issue?
Yeah, sure. So the issue of Crimea. Crimea is formerly was a peninsula of the country of Ukraine. Now, even before that, it had been for a long time a Russian territory. However, in 2014, Russia took back the Crimea, in the midst of a lot of political turmoil going on in Ukraine. And so at this time, there was what was called the Euromaidan protest movement going on in Ukraine, looking to overthrow the president at the time, Viktor Yanukovych. And soon after Viktor Yanukovych was overthrown, in fact, several Ukrainian former presidents and big politicians signed a letter saying that the post-coup government in Ukraine should rescind Russia's their lease to the naval base in Sevastopol in Crimea. And so it was soon after this proposal that Russia came in and said, yeah, that's not happening, and they annexed the territory. Two things that should be noted, however, is that Russia's Black Sea Fleet has been stationed in Crimea since the late 1700s. And so this is like a long-term thing that Russia absolutely was not going to see happen. And B, another thing that should be noted is that the annexation and the invasion, quote unquote, of Crimea was done largely bloodlessly. So it was just Russian soldiers that were already in the peninsula just left their bases and kind of, came out and, took over, I guess. However, Pew and Gallup and a bunch of Western polling firms have since gone to Crimea and talked to Crimeans. And people there say that, we're glad that Russia did this. We don't want to be part of the Ukraine anymore. We don't like the developments in that country. And so that's the basic gist of the whole controversy over the Crimean Peninsula.
Yeah, and I think one of the key things that should show the people of Crimea have a real reason, to question the government now in Kiev is the fact that there are some neo-Nazis within that government. And so, Will, do you want to just mention briefly that Azov battalion?
Yeah, sure. Well, the Azov battalion was one of these. There were several actually, far-right sort of, really you'd call them neo-Nazi. These are people who celebrate and worship a guy named Stepan Bandera, who is a Nazi World War II Nazi-era collaborator. Helped to exterminate Ukrainian Jewry and stuff like that. And so these are the type of people who make up the Azov battalion. And there was a guy actually who was a high-up leader in the protest movement, Andrew Paraby. who is the founder of a party called the Social Nationalist Party, which is an extremely far-right, ultra-nationalist party in Ukraine. And this guy ended up as like the Secretary of National Defense, I think, in the post-coup government. And so this is like a high-up neo-Nazi leader. And the Azov Battalion was just like one of the militias that was basically incorporated into the Ukrainian armed forces. And it's basically manned by a bunch of neo-Nazis. And I think there was even an American law that was passed that prevented the arming of this specific battalion because of just how kooky and, Nazi-like they were.
Right. And, it's very interesting, too, since we've been talking about the media on this episode, that you have the situation where, there's plenty of people who have referred to Donald Trump as a Nazi. And yet you have people like Lindsey Graham and John McCain, who those same people would call the respectable Republicans, that have actually gone and spoken to these Ukrainian militias with neo-Nazi affiliations and sympathies. And, and nobody has, pointed out, oh, well, John McCain is clearly a Nazi.
Right. And yeah, like another reason I made the distinction too between like, neo-Nazis and just right-leaning people is because of how our media paints people like Trump and like, certain just like right-leaning elements, certain nationalist elements as Nazis. But no, when I'm saying Nazis in Ukraine, I mean actual like Sieg-heiling, Hitler-loving Nazis here. And so we shouldn't, we should always keep that distinction in mind. It's not what American media calls Nazism is not really, always what Nazism really is.
Right. So we have another place where Trump and Senator Rand Paul has been another person that's talked about this a lot. The idea that, the mutual defense portion of the NATO treaty. And what that says is that, all NATO countries come to the aid of attacks of NATO members. And so when the United States approves a country like Macedonia or Montenegro or, any of these Eastern European countries to join NATO, the U.S. is then agreeing that if those countries get attacked, that we would add, just like the Americans have been attacked, if New York City or Los Angeles had been attacked, and respond in force that way. And, Trump calling these alliances and the importance of NATO into question is something that routinely gets him just bashed in the mainstream media and by the so-called respectable kind of establishment foreign policy folks. So, Will, do you want to go into a little bit what your thoughts on the mutual defense pact are, and at least maybe Donald Trump calling this into question isn't such a bad thing?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, what you're referring to specifically is Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, which calls on all the other nations to respond. If any of them are attacked, it requires that they respond as if it's an attack on their own nation. Now, I think you mentioned Rand Paul. Rand Paul has actually been pretty good on calling out this, the problems with this treaty, or with this aspect of the treaty. And it's the same old, founding fathers kind of exhortation against entangling alliances. This is the very definition of an entangling alliance, where, you treat any attack on another country as on an ally as an attack on yourself. That is the definition of being entangled in an alliance. Now, a reason why, this is not always a good thing to do is because countries like, this is among many other reasons, but countries like Montenegro and Macedonia are very small and unable to even, to provide anything to this alliance. And so really all this is doing is, pledging the United States and American tax dollars to come, clear across the world and fight for these foreign countries. But yet they, certainly would not be able to, do the same thing. They couldn't muster the same kind of aid in the vice versa. Now, Donald Trump got in hot water because he said something about the Macedonians being aggressive people and all this stuff. And of course, he kind of botched the point. That's not the point, is that Macedonians are aggressive. The point is that when you give this kind of assurance to some small little country, you might actually embolden them to do things they wouldn't otherwise do. So you might embolden them to sort of like start territorial disputes with their neighbors or whatever, because they know that the United States is now backing them. And so Donald Trump kind of tries to address this, but he doesn't do it very well. Now, another thing is Donald Trump often has come out with rhetoric hostile to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. However, I don't think any of his opposition to NATO has truly been opposition to the organization itself. Really, if you listen to what Donald Trump says and his criticisms, is mostly about getting countries to pay more, getting them to pay their fair share, and getting them to pay what is stipulated in NATO as sort of the requirement that each country has to pay a certain percentage of GDP. However, the amount of his rhetoric that can be construed as like critical of NATO in general, I welcome that. I think that's it's almost unheard of for a president to come out in opposition to NATO. So I think that's good.
Yeah, well, I find the 2% thing interesting because everybody talks about how dangerous Russia is, yet the countries closest to Russia aren't spending 2% of their GDP on their military. So, you either have to accept the fact that the United States is heavily subsidizing their armed forces, and that's the reason they're able to spend so little, or they're really not afraid of Russia. And in the case of Germany, at least, it's just they're not afraid of Russia. They say the Europeans could defend themselves against Russia. And this is largely true. I mean, Russia doesn't have a massive population. I think it's just under 150 million people now. And while that's, the biggest country in Europe, when you look at the UK, France, and Germany, and you start to tally up all these other nations, the GDP far exceeds Russia's, and their population far exceeds Russia. And, while there's not the same nuclear capability, the conventional military capabilities of all these countries, not to mention that both the UK and France possess a nuclear deterrent, it's no wonder why a majority of Germans don't think that they need the United States to defend themselves from Russia. Right. And as Will pointed out earlier, a lot of this pretense involves the idea that the Russians are aggressive and looking to expand their borders, and the best people could usually cite is the Crimean Peninsula. And, we've kind of already talked about how that's really not an example of Russian aggression.
Right, exactly. And as you're saying here about, the parity between, it doesn't seem like these Russian neighbors are all that afraid of Russia. And yeah, Russia has a pretty fearsome military and good, some decent aircraft and has nuclear weapons. However, if you look at the Russian economy, which I think, the economy does matter. That's where states get their money. That's where they get their wealth, is from the productive economy. It's like half the size of California's economy. The GDP of Russia as an entire country is, I think, about half the size of what California produces economically. Or it's about the size of, I think, Italy, too. And so we're really not talking about a terrifying juggernaut here in terms of economics.
Right. Kind of the unique position that Russia, I think, holds, Will, is their nuclear capabilities much more than anything else.
Right, certainly. That's what gives them the biggest edge for sure. But in sort of a conventional conflict, yeah, Russia I don't think would be able to, maintain that long of a war.
I also want to mention on today's episode that Donald Trump has invited Vladimir Putin to the White House for a future summit. However, it doesn't look like that summit is going forward anytime soon. We have an announcement that it looks like it'll happen 2019 at the earliest.
Right. I mean, I think this is, it's sort of a mixed thing, because I was happy to hear the news that Trump was, inviting Putin to come to the White House. However, I think maybe if it's still going to happen, maybe giving it this time in between will allow the media and stuff to cool down a little bit. I mean, who knows by what's going to be said by this time next year, or, by next year. Who knows what the line will be about Russia then, but I don't know, maybe this is a good strategic move by Trump to sort of put that delay there.
Maybe my concern was more that Donald Trump is just so erratic in his position that even if the media has cooled off in 6 months, he may be heated back up.
Right. Yeah, that's certainly true.
All right. Well, the other thing I want to get into in today's episode that I think is important is we have the final version of the 2019 NDAA. It hasn't been signed yet. Both houses have passed it, and the committee has gotten together and put together the joint bill. And so this, I guess, will be the thing that ends up passing. Of course, this is the funding for the Pentagon. 7.75 trillion, I guess, is a round number to say where we're at now and the massive amount of spending on the military, just for the year 2019, of course. However, these bills often include a lot of provisions, and a lot of them are very important. And one of them, I guess there's quite a few that I want to go over in today's episode. The first one we'll talk about is that there's no funding for the Space Force. This is something that Donald Trump ended up creating. However, they're not going to fund it. I think they ordered James Mattis to put together some reports on it. But one of the interesting things about when Trump announced the Space Force, he said it would be a separate but equal branch from the Air Force. And this is, I guess, long been the bureaucratic battle, and why the Pentagon has said they don't need a Space Force, is because we already have the Air Force, and I believe NASA is part of the Air Force, or is tied to the Air Force. And so we really don't need that. Also, there's the issue of space militarization with, seems to be something that's on Vladimir Putin's radar. I don't know if Trump is quite enough of an intellectual to have, foresaw this being an issue, but it could be a real issue having another, space race, this time a weaponized one between the United States and Russia. So, Will, do you have any thoughts on the Space Force? I don't think we've talked about this on the show in the past. And, what do you think maybe of the potential bureaucratic battle going on right now behind the scenes, as I'm sure companies like Boeing and Lockheed are trying to get a Space Force created to add a few $1 billion to the U.S. budget, while you have pushback, from, I'm guessing, the Air Force, who feels like they're probably going to have their funding cut by this.
Yeah, this sounds like a real kind of like potential to create a lot of new boondoggles, with all these contractors and stuff. Because like it's just inventing a new need, like you don't need, like nobody's, like space is not militarized yet, so there's no like threat you could cite up there that we have to go counter. And so this is purely just like a perfect open field for contractors to just start inventing needs and, coming up with new projects. And I kind of expect that's the case. However, I'm kind of happy to see Congress refuse to fund it. I wish they would refuse to fund other parts of the Pentagon,
Right. Well, and it would be nice too if rather than saying, having a plan to create a space force, force the Pentagon to, I guess, come up with a acceptable treaty that they could work on with Russia. That this would have to go through the State Department too, but start to work coming up with a treaty between the United States, China, India potentially, all the Russia that are going to want to develop, weapons in space, and how we're going to prevent this. Cause, we don't need a whole nother territory, a whole nother class of, nuclear weapons and, I'm sure trillions of wasted human wealth while some of us, suffer and starve to death.
Yeah, there's actually a treaty. I thought there was one already for space too, but I know there's for a fact one for Antarctica that a lot of like major world powers have signed on to, agreeing not to militarize that continent. And so maybe they could look to that for some pointers. Oh,
good point, Will. The next provision I wanted to talk about is that they say no F-35s for Turkey unless Turkey meets some conditions. There's a lot of interesting things going on between the relationship between the United States and Turkey. Of course, there's now the long-running issue behind the United States backing the Syrian Kurds, the YPG. Turkey says that the YPG is just the PKK. The PKK is the Turkish Kurdish militia, and I guess they would label themselves as insurgents or freedom fighters, while you have the Turkish government labeling them a terrorist organization. And so Turkey says that, well, the PKK and the YPG are the same thing, and so the United States is arming terrorists to the Turkish state right now in Syria, and this is a real problem for us. Other issues between the United States and Turkey include Turkey's coming purchase of the S-400 missile system for Russia. NATO had, I guess, planned to have a joint radar system, and if Turkey engages in the S-400 system and buys that, then they can't buy the U.S. radar systems and can't be plugged into the larger NATO network. There's also some military planners who see potential problems with Turkey obtaining the S-400 missile system and the F-35, and that this would give Russia some kind of tactical advantage over the U.S.'s new stealth fighters. Other issues include kind of Turkey's position now towards Iran and even the Qataris. I'm sure Turkey has been sympathetic and supportive of the Qataris. They actually have a military base in Qatar and buy a lot of oil from Iran, and say that they're not going to abide by the U.S. sanctions and stop buying Iranian oil. So, Will, I know I just set up a lot there, but what do you think about the no F-35s? And, I'm sure this is something that could be overdone. There's obviously, more provisions in the bill that say if Turkey takes these steps, then they could once again buy F-35s. And so I'm sure some bureaucrat could stamp some papers and approve that, but there's a lot going on between the relationship between these two NATO powers.
Yeah, so I think there's sort of two trends that one is sort of good and one is bad. So I kind of like the trend that the U.S. is going to refuse to sell weapons to other countries. Certainly we should not be selling these weapons of war, these massively destructive weapons to human rights abusers, which Turkey, I think we could certainly say, especially under Erdogan, and especially since the coup, that recent coup a year or so ago. Things have really been cracking down there. So yeah, it's probably good that they're not going to get some of these dangerous weapons. However, the other trend that I don't like, though, is the U.S. throwing its weight around as an empire, and sort of, in this case, the outcome is kind of good that the Turks aren't getting this weapon, at least for now. But the overall trend of what the U.S. is really doing, I mean, we do this in a million other ways with other carrots and sticks around the world too. And so I don't like that sort of trend of the U.S. throwing its weight around. However, yeah, if Turkey is deprived of this terrible weapon of war, then fine by me. Another thing I'll say, though, is you mentioned that Turkey is refusing to comply with American sanctions on Iran. And I think that's just a very like illustrative case of like, you know, the world sort of chafes under U.S. imperialism in a lot of cases. You know, Germany wants to do trade with Iran, and they sort of are prevented from doing so. And so it's just interesting how the world kind of chafes under these sanctions, and the U.S. Turkey and Germany and these other countries would like to do business with Iran, but the U.S. is not having it. And so I think that's interesting how we put such restrictions on the rest of the world.
Right. I even saw that Sri Lanka was looking at undermining the U.S. sanctions by going back to the barter system and shipping Iran tea in exchange for oil. Wow. So, you know, it does look like even some of these smaller and less powerful states will just undermine the U.S. at this point. I'm guessing a lot of that has to do with just how ridiculous the Trump position has been on Iran. And maybe this is something worth getting into now, Will, is that Trump, you know, has full caps lock tweet, you know, bashing Iran, saying, "Don't you ever threaten me again." And, Will, I don't know, what were your thoughts on that tweet?
Yeah, we talked about this a little off air, and I think we both agreed that it kind of looks like Trump might be trying to sort of replicate the Korea strategy with Kim Jong-un and sort of playing this big blustery, you know, playing that card, the bad cop card, and try to get them to come to the table. Something that I think kind of supports that interpretation is Trump just recently, after that tweet, I think a couple days later, has said that like he's ready to have a real deal with Iran and wants to have like a real agreement with them that's way better than the JCPOA that Obama had signed. And so, I don't know, I think a lot of people were really worried about that tweet, but I think maybe that was a little overwrought to worry about it.
Right. In the Rouhani statement that he was responding to, I think it was Rouhani, it wasn't the Ayatollah.
Yeah.
That he was responding to was just saying, you know, we could be the, you know, best of friends or the worst of enemies. And, you know, Trump takes that and, you know, flips out and makes this ultra crazy statement. And, you know, kind of based on what's happening in the media and Trump understanding how, like, you know, their hysterical reactions to him are causing him political problems, you would think he has to realize what Rouhani is doing there and how his statement is just way overblown and way out of line. So I tend to agree with you that he's trying to play out the North Korea policy in Iran. Now, I think this is a terrible, terrible and stupid idea. The problem is that North Korea and Iran are fundamentally different in their, you know, places in negotiating with the United States. Now, there is some similarity in that both North Korea have worked out a deal with the Americans, the agreed framework, and were within compliance with the NPT for a time before John Bolton and George Bush and Dick Cheney kicked North Korea out. Likewise, Iran entered into a similar kind of agreement with the United States where they were in the NPT, but accepted extra protocols over their nuclear weapons program and would limit their civilian program in certain ways. But Iran, along with that agreement, also as part of that agreement, destroyed a lot of their very important nuclear technology, their AROC reactor. They destroyed a lot of their centrifuges. I think they stopped some of the production at one of their like medical facilities where like they enrich uranium up to 20% in order to use it in cancer drugs. Still far short of the percentage of enriched uranium you would need to make a nuclear bomb. But, you know, so fundamentally it's different because Iran has recently made all these concessions. What happened with North Korea happened back under, you know, the 2002 or so. And so North Korea had made a lot of like nuclear gains between 2002 and 2018. And so North Korea has a real program to give up. However, the Iranians just made all these concessions, and then the U.S. vacated the deal, 2 years later, Will, when they really weren't even following it the whole time to begin with. So this seems like it's going to be a real problem, and I'm not surprised that the Iranian reaction to this is no, we're not going to negotiate again. Look what happened last time.
Right, exactly. Like there are some differences for sure between Korea and Iran. As you pointed out, Korea had a pretty far along nuclear weapons program, whereas Iran had no such thing and had a very good arms control agreement, which Donald Trump scrapped. Now, a slight difference between the Korean and Iran situations was that with the Korea case, with the agreed framework, John Bolton, it was the principal character there, really pushed the Koreans to get out of it themselves. Like, really just kept doing a bunch of things until the Koreans were like, you know what, screw this, we're done. Whereas with Iran, they couldn't do that. They couldn't get Iran to leave the deal. And so Trump, had to do it himself, which I think probably says something about Iran's willingness to like, I don't know, they were willing, we had them on a deal, we had a good agreement hammered out, and now he scrapped it. And so, yeah, I don't know if the same playbook is really going to apply in this country.
And I'm sure another very important factor here is that, Kim Jong-un is the undisputed supreme leader of North Korea. And while I'm sure, he does have like coalitions or, people within his government who would look to overthrow him if he made certain decisions, largely he controls that country. Iran is a democracy, at least to some degree, where, they will have more hawkish and less hawkish candidates and the people will get to vote on them. Yeah. Even if the religious leaders of the country get to limit pretty heavily who actually gets to run. But you did have Rouhani elected by Iran popularly, and he did decide to go make a deal with the Americans and pursue an agreement with Barack Obama that would limit Iran's, even civilian nuclear program. And, this is going to disempower that portion and that faction of Iran. And I'm sure, imagine how the Americans, specifically the Trump voters, would respond if, let's say, we cut a deal with the Russians where we agreed to disable, 100 of our nuclear weapons, and then Russia withdrew from the agreement. That may be grounds for nuclear war.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I think that's an important difference. The next provision of the 2019 NDAA that I think is pretty important, well, not really, but should have been, and that is Tulsi Gabbard's Stop Arming Terrorists Act finally got in. And what this does is it's going to require the Pentagon to submit a report to Congress that basically explains how they're going to make sure that the weapons that the United States gives to the Syrian rebels don't go to jihadists. Now, this program would have been very important from, 2012 to 2016, but unfortunately it only came now after Trump has mostly ended and shut down that program. But I guess, it's cool that it finally made it in, or maybe it's a bad thing because now it's going to happen and they're going to pretend like they didn't arm terrorists this whole time.
Right. Yeah, that'd be an unfortunate way they could spin it. But yeah, as we've covered on this show for, I would say many months, is, the United States is
a year.
Yeah, at least a year. Yeah. Is the United States' relationship with, rebels in Syria, which, they called for a long time a moderate rebel force. But as we've sort of reported on this show, they're not moderate rebels. These are the most hardcore right-wing sort of jihadist death squads out there. This is like, if not ISIS itself, if not the Islamic State itself, then ISIS's, very close allies, Arar al-Sham and, the Al-Qaeda affiliate and people who associate with them, like Harakat Nuruddin al-Zinki, who had been caught beheading a young boy. We gave, not only the United States through at least 2 separate programs through the Pentagon and the CIA, but also our allies too, Saudi and Qatar and, the Emiratis, who were funneling in insane amounts of weaponry from the Balkans and Eastern Europe. And so, yeah, this has sort of been the U.S. relationship with the Syrian rebels all this time. And I guess I'm glad to see that there's this legislation going forward. But yeah, as you said, it would have been a lot more useful starting in 2012 on.
All right. And then the last provision, I thought that was pretty important, is that the Congress is actually looking to take back some war-making authority, I think, on the Yemen civil war. In part, this may be because when the Senate was debating invoking the Yemen War Powers Act because Trump was waging an unconstitutional war in Yemen, the Pentagon lied to the United States government that there weren't any U.S. troops supporting the Saudi coalition. That turns out not to be true. And I'm sure made a few people in the Senate actually irate. A lot of these people are liars, but some of them are just misinformed. And so if the Pentagon comes in and says, and General Mattis says, well, sir, I know it looks like we're at war here, but we're just refueling some Saudi planes. They're mostly bombing terrorists, and that's really all that's going on. There's no troops on the ground whatsoever. You say, okay, well, I believe the general, and, you go cast a vote that way, and then it turns out a couple weeks later you find out, oh, we do have troops on the ground there. This seems, to be a little bit of a problem. Also, there's the AP reporting, I believe, on the torture prisons the UAE is running in Yemen. Senator Chris Murphy has, gone as far to explain that really these get tied back to the United States, because everybody in Yemen just sees them as U.S. run prisons since it's the United States backing the Emiratis that's making this possible. And of course, if, let's say Assad had torture prisons or something like that, the U.S. would be raising a big stink about it at the UN, but nothing at all ever gets said once a U.S. ally doing it. So these things lead, one of the provisions in the NDAA to say that the United States will not provide mid-air refueling to the Saudi coalition unless they meet conditions and the Secretary of State signs off on it. So the obvious downside here is we're going to keep providing the mid-air refueling because the Secretary of State will just sign off on it, whatever Saudi Arabia does. But Will, what's your overall, opinion?
Well, I'm glad to see that, that U.S. lawmakers are finally starting to pay more attention to this Yemen issue. We've had other, proposed legislation as well that I believe we've probably covered on this show. You and I have been talking about the Yemen thing since the very beginning, since probably 2015 when the bombing campaign started. But U.S. lawmakers have not. They have only just begun to start to address this. And I think a reason for that is that the vast majority of these lawmakers are completely for this, that they're in the pocket of the Saudis and the Gulf sheikdoms who are, carrying out this slaughter in Yemen, carrying out what we have called, I think rightfully, a genocide. With reports of 1 million diseased people and tens of thousands dying under bombing raids. That's, I think, legitimate.
Right. So, I do think it's unfortunate that Congress gave all the power to the Secretary of State to kind of make the call on this issue. But, I guess it's, worth noting that, Congress is kind of finally stepping up and making a little bit of a difference. Now, you point out Congress's, relationship with the weapon salesmen and how that's, I'm sure, providing a lot of reason for why they're so, supportive or at least, neglectful of regulating this war. But I think another issue is that the media just hasn't covered this war. And I think, Will, you've probably seen the same article I have, and I think it was originally published at FAIR. And that is, MSNBC hasn't covered the Yemen civil war or America's role in the Yemen civil war for an entire year. And then you read a story from the anti-media, and in that same amount of time, they've done 466 stories, more than one a day, covering Stormy Daniels.
My God. That's disgusting. That's just like, I don't know. That's just those numbers alone, I think, make the point.
Right. I guess you don't have to add too much on, but that's the problem. And somebody, on Facebook asked, well, what would, let's say that MSNBC had run 466 stories on Yemen and, run none on Stormy Daniels. What difference would that make? And, for anybody who really wants to ask that question, I'll link to an article and 10-minute, it's a segment that ran on PBC NewsHour. Jane Lynch is the reporter who smuggled herself into Yemen. And look at these children here and how much they're suffering and how much the people are suffering. And if you tell me that every morning when people drink their coffee, they have to look at a Yemeni child that's starving to death, that they're not going to eventually demand something. And that this isn't going to start to impact the congressmen who, I mean, as much as, they're bought and paid for, they do have hearts. And, eventually, their children may be asking why those kids are starving to death. And as much as I'm sure they would spin this as, Houthi being controlled by Iran, at the same time, it's very obvious that the U.S. has a lot of control here to make a lot of this, starving and suffering stop. I think something really could get done.
Yeah, and I mean, if the Yemen story had been covered as much as the Stormy Daniels thing, it certainly would make a difference. I mean, it makes a difference when the mainstream media covers what we would call propaganda and lies about Syria and stuff, about chemical attacks and stuff. People talk about that. People are saddened by the images of dead children and stuff. Even though we sometimes challenge that and go, where did that image come from and things like that. The media,
including the president.
Right, exactly. Yeah, he's apparently sensitive to these kind of photos too. It's just the media often does the opposite of a good job in covering these things, and they put the attention in the wrong direction or something. But no, certainly the media can make a difference. If they covered this Yemen thing as much as they covered the Stormy Daniels thing, maybe people would be talking about Yemen as much or, more as they're talking about Stormy Daniels.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me on today's show. It's kind of cool to have you on for a show where we're not talking about one of your articles and just, doing like a regular co-hosting duty here. So Will, I really appreciate it. Tell my audience where to find you and all of your work.
Yeah, man, I'm really glad to come on your show anytime. It's my favorite place to come talk about geopolitics and stuff. And if people want to find my work, they can find me at the Libertarianinstitute.org in the featured articles section in the blog. They can find me sometimes at antiwar.com in the viewpoint section and at Consortium News. And if they really want to support my work, they can find me at patreon.com/WKPjournalist.
All right, well, again, thank you so much for coming on the show. And to find this show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. Go to libertarianinstitute.org. You will find my show and my daily news roundup there on the homepage. Immersionnews.com is my news website. at KYAAALE on Twitter. Facebook is Libertarian Union. And then if you really like my show and, you want to donate to my show as well, patreon.com/foreign policy focus.
All right, good.